Hi everybody, it's Dr. Philip again. This is going to be the degree options lecture, but before we get started with that, I wanted to touch base about the career assessment assignment. It's coming up. It's due on the 15th by the end of the day. That's this Friday. By the end of the day, that means any time before midnight on Saturday is considered on time. Okay? Now, it's not a huge issue. Because you can hand in one of the 3 assignments late and everything's fine, but I don't recommend starting the semester off by handing the first one late. So I've already received a variety of emails from people about a couple of technical problems or issues or how to get to the different assessments, but on the whole people have been doing pretty well from what I've seen so far. So so far so good. We're going to talk about degree options today, and the degree options we're going to talk about are going to be mainly in the field of psychology, as well as some of the related fields like rehab counseling, licensed mental health counseling, or counselor education, social work, and so on. As I mentioned before, people with bachelor's degrees in psychology will often go into any host of fields outside of psychology, like business or medicine or criminal justice or sociology or law or what have you. And while psychology sets one up pretty well to go into any host of fields, we're going to be speaking more specifically about what advanced degrees in psychology can get you. Okay. The next topic we're going to be touching on, I think, is jobs that you get with an undergraduate degree. So we'll be covering that pretty soon. At the master's level and at the doctoral level, certainly, education becomes much more specialized. So take, for example, when you get a bachelor's degree in psychology, you probably take somewhere between about, depending on the university, usually between about 30 to 40 credits worth of psychology and related credits, so things like statistics or something along those lines. So let's take the high end and say 40 credits. But you need generally about 120 or more credits to graduate with your bachelor's degree, so maybe 1/3 of your credits are going to be specifically geared towards your discipline. The other 80 are in, as you know, things like the humanities or other social sciences or hard sciences or math or English or what have you. And so approximately 1/3 or fewer of your credits as an undergraduate are going to be specifically geared towards psychology. In graduate school, that varies drastically. I should say that changes drastically. So in a master's program, if you take anywhere between 48 to 60 credits, depending on the master's program, the vast majority of them are going to be for your major. In other words, they're going to be specifically geared towards that particular arena. So, for example, my master's degree is in mental health counseling, and it was a 60-credit master's and a 72-credit specialist degree program. And I think that all said and done, we had 3 electives. So 51 out of 60 credits in the master's and 63 out of 72 credits in the specialist degree were not only specifically in that field, counselor education, counseling, therapy, those kinds of areas, but they were also predetermined. Now sometimes that's because of licensure in a particular state, and the programs pretty much delineate what courses you're going to take so that you can get licensed. We'll talk about licensure and so on a little bit later. And in doctoral level work, again, the same type of thing holds true. If you're taking 100 credits, probably the better part of anywhere between 85 to 95 of those credits are probably going to be specifically geared towards your field. You may have to take statistics or something that may be a little bit out, but the vast majority of credits that you're going to take are going to be in your field. And so that's something to consider. What that means is that if you're going to be spending that much time and energy in a program, it helps to be pretty sure that that's the field that you want to go into. In other words, you need to be pretty clear about your goals. Now, that for some people that means that they need to go into a particular degree program. Okay, and that could be, for example, let me move this so that I don't keep looking off to the side for you guys. Okay, that's better. That could mean that you know that you want to get a PhD in developmental psychology, for example. Other people want to get in a particular career field, and there may be more than one degree that allows you to do that. So, for example, if you wanted to be a licensed mental health counselor, you could become one with degrees, with master's degrees in psychology, clinical or counseling, as well as a master's degree in counseling through generally a counselor education program. And so sometimes there are multiple degrees that can get you to a particular career or career field. And what that means is, so some people will actually get a degree to get into a field, or some people will get into a field and pick a degree that fits. You can do it either way. It really just depends on the field that you choose and how honed in or specific they are about what degrees allow you to acquire the necessary training, licensure, and so on in order to get in that field. All this means is when you're going to be picking a graduate program or graduate field, you should be fairly clear about what your goals are and what you want to do with that degree. Otherwise, you could really spend a lot of time, effort, money in a program area that you may not be interested, and to some extent, you could end up being either unprepared to do something that you really want, or find yourself very well prepared for a career that you're not particularly interested in. So I think of a friend of mine, actually someone I started doctoral work with. He was in my my incoming doctoral degree program, and he was an excellent student, did very well in classes, and was by all accounts a very good therapist, but it just wasn't really all that interesting to him, and he didn't bail out of the doctoral program until year 4. And so he ended up spending a pretty significant amount of time and money and effort before he really kind of made the decision to switch career fields. So you don't have to have everything mapped out of exactly what you want to do, but being reasonably clear on either the degree you want to get and why you want to get it, or the career field you want to be in and what degree or degrees you need in order to get into that field. Those are kind of important points. We'll talk more about the distinctions between master's and doctoral programs a little bit later, but generally speaking, master's programs take less time. They're generally less expensive as far as money that you would have to pay, but we'll talk about how that may not be true because of what we call funding in a little bit. The good thing about master's programs is they're much shorter, and so what happens sometimes is if you're not real sure that you want to go into a particular field, you may want to choose a master's program instead of a doctoral program, because that can allow you to get your feet wet and try out the area before you put in quite the amount of effort that you might in a doctoral program. The other thing is for people who don't play the numbers game well, and the numbers game for me is, what I mean by that is GRE and GPA. So when you are applying for graduate program, just like in applying for undergraduate, you had kind of the SAT. In graduate work, at least in psychology, you have the GRE. That's kind of like it's called the Graduate Record Examination. It's kind of like the SAT for graduate school in many ways. Well, it's the requirements to get into a master's program are less stringent than those to get into a doctoral program. So not only can a master's program allow you to get your feet wet to see if that's something you want to do, but if your grades and or GREs are not quite strong enough or don't make you competitive enough at the doctoral level, you can often go to a master's program, kind of earn your keep by showing that you can do the work at a master's level, and therefore you are capable of doing graduate work. You can develop another GPA, because a graduate GPA is separate from your undergraduate GPA. And so sometimes people will go that route in order to kind of work themselves into a doctoral program. So let's see, move on to the next kind of piece. One of the things I really want to stress to you is choose a graduate degree or a vocational field, career field, either one, that is based on factors that are important to you. Okay? So for example, just because your mentor or your favorite professor had a PhD, that's not why you should get one. Okay? You should be working towards a master's or a PhD because those degrees are going to allow you to get into a field that you want to work in. Okay? The truth is there are a number of factors that are important to consider when trying to decide what graduate program you want to go into. And I don't even mean master's versus doctorate. I mean where and for how long and in what field. And so, for example, how much time you want to spend in graduate school. By the time people get done with undergraduate work, sometimes they're a little tired of being in school. Well, a master's program is generally going to take somewhere probably between 2 and 3 years to complete, whereas a doctoral program will probably take between 4 and 7. And so if you don't really want to have a good 5 or 6 years in front of you, as far as continuing in graduate school, doctoral program might not be your cup of tea at that point in time. Another option that you have is you can finish your undergraduate, take a break, go out and work, and then go back to school later. That's what I did. And many people do that because sometimes they need a break, or they need to recharge, or they need to really try and figure out what they want to do, and that's fine, but you really need to know yourself to make sure that you'll go back, because there are plenty of people who had the intention of going back, but then they get a job, and then they get married, and then they end up having children, and that doesn't actually happen. So it's often kind of important to know yourself. But the time investment can be a big piece. So how much time do you really want to spend? So for some people, the extra time is not that big of a deal. For other people, they say, I don't know if I could do another 5 or 6 years. Okay. Related to something I just mentioned, family issues or potential family issues can be an important thing. If you want to get married and have children within a certain period of time, it's not that that can't be done when you're in graduate school, but graduate school makes that much more difficult to be able to handle all the responsibilities inherent in that. A third issue might be monetary investment. How much money are you really willing to spend? Master's programs are only 2 years, but very rarely do you get funded or paid while you're in a master's program. So most people have to take out loans. They may get some scholarship, but most people have to take out loans or have somebody pay for it. The flip side to a doctoral program, while it's longer, PhD programs, usually you get funded, which means you get paid either to do research or teach classes. And while you don't get paid particularly well, it is money that you earn, or sometimes there's a trade-out. So for example, when I was at UF in the doctoral program, I came in with a master's degree so I could teach right off the bat, and that paid me a certain stipend per semester, but it also allowed me to take 9 free credits of graduate work per semester. Graduate credits are usually somewhere around probably 2 to 3 times as expensive as undergraduate credits. So even back then, I think that the graduate credits were probably $300, and now they're probably closer to $400 or $500 a credit. So that's money you didn't have to pay out of pocket. That happens in doctoral programs with pretty consistently. It happens with pretty it's fairly regular, I should say, that most people in doctoral programs are going to get some sort of funding. In a PsyD program, which is a doctorate of psychology, it's a very specific degree, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. PsyD programs don't generally fund as well, so a lot of people in PsyD programs don't get funded. So again, that probably will cost you more money. As I mentioned before, another consideration about master's versus doctoral program or certain fields is going to be your numbers. So what's your GPA, what are your GREs, and how competitive does that make you for that particular degree or that particular field. And I'll give you guidelines for that in probably not too long, probably about 15-20 minutes. Another factor to consider is career options. How sure are you that you want to do a particular job, and does your degree allow you to have more than one option as far as possible vocations? So again, as an example, my degree in counseling psychology part of the reason I chose that degree is it allowed me a wide range, or a reasonably wide range, of career choices. So I can see clients in private practice. I can work for an institution like a hospital or a counseling center or a community mental health center. I can teach. I can focus more on testing and assessment. I can do forensic work. I can work in the industrial organizational I/O consulting realm. I could do things like I could provide workshops for continuing education. So there's a number of different possible career areas for me, and that's part of the reason I chose this degree, is that if I wanted to switch mid-career, I could do that. And the truth is, in the 10 years that I've been out, in other words, in the 10 years since I graduated with my doctoral degree, or almost 10 years, I've really had 3 different careers. I worked in a counseling center, and I taught college at UNF full-time for about 6 years, and for the last 2.5, I've worked in the VA with the Veterans Administration. Now, those are not drastically different fields, but 2 of them are more based on counseling and direct services at the counseling center in the VA, and the other one, teaching at UNF, is much more instructional. There's certainly mentoring and so on that goes on, and there was research that I conducted, but those are different career fields, and my degree allowed me to do that. And so that's part of the reason I chose it. Another factor to consider, as silly as this is, climate concerns. For some people that seems ridiculous, but I remember when I was applying for doctoral programs, I wasn't going to go anywhere where it snowed because I didn't want to live year-round in a colder climate. And so you could literally follow the southern coast of the United States and see the graduate programs to which I applied. I think the farthest north I applied was Stanford, and I applied there because, well, 1, at Stanford, 2, the weather's not particularly cold up there like it would be in Minnesota or Michigan or something along those lines, and 3, Albert Bandura was still active on the faculty there at that point in time, and I thought that was pretty damn neat. But I had well, I'll tell you the story about my interview, my phone interview with Stanford some other time. But climate concerns is sometimes something to consider. Another possible consideration are work issues or potential work issues. In other words, are you planning to work while you're going to school? And if so, master's programs are more likely to allow you to do that than doctoral programs. So that's something to consider. In certain areas like counseling or clinical psychology, theoretical orientation can be an important piece. So for example, as I mentioned before, I applied at Stanford for doctoral work. It would not have been a particularly good fit for me because they were more behavioral in their theoretical orientation, while I was more in the kind of humanistic, constructivist, existential realm. And so those two areas don't often see eye to eye, and so that probably would not have been a good fit for me. Another consideration is going to be the orientation towards research. In other words, how much research do you want to do? In a master's program, some master's programs require theses, others don't. And so if you are, well, essentially there are three types of people. There are people who love doing research, there are people who are okay with doing research, and then there are people who'd probably rather hit themselves in the foot with a hammer than do research. If you're in the first category, you're going to want a PhD program will kind of fit you well because there's often a very heavy research emphasis in a PhD program. A PsyD program probably not going to be quite as helpful. If you're in the second category, which is pretty much mine, which was I was okay with doing research, a doctoral program will present certain challenges, but still pretty well within your wheelhouse. If you're in the third category and you really don't want to do research, a PhD program is not going to be a good fit for you. A PsyD program at the doctoral level could be. Master's programs, again, in the clinical counseling or counselor ed realm, you usually do not have to do a thesis, or in many programs you do not, and so you can get through it and be able to become a licensed mental health counselor. And so you need to know essentially how far on the research bandwagon are you. If you don't particularly care for research, a doctoral program is really not going to be a very good fit, particularly a PhD program. A PsyD program might be a better fit if you want to do the doctoral, go the doctoral route. What else? Specialization area or subfield can be an important factor to consider. So, for example, let's say you wanted to go into neuropsych. Well, then a clinical psychology program is probably going to be a better fit for you than others, and a doctoral clinical program is kind of probably the best fit because you're going to be able to do more with your degree. And so there are a lot of reasons that I mentioned and a host of other reasons that are going to be specific to you, how close you are to family and friends or any host of kind of issues. Make sure to touch on the important issues for you before you choose a graduate degree. Now, for some people that might just be reputation or how likely you are to get a job or any host of things. Again, figure out the important pieces for you and help that guide your decision as to either a graduate degree and or a graduate program. The truth is, going to graduate school is a big step and it's a pretty significant undertaking, and so make sure to choose that degree or a discipline or program based on the things that are important to you. If you don't have career plans as of now, don't panic, but it's probably a good idea to start looking into that. And to be honest, that's part of the reason I had you do the career assessment assignment, so that for those people who are clear on what they want to do, that can just help emphasize it to them. For those people who are not sure, they have a couple of different jobs or careers they may be interested in, this can give you a little more information. And for those people who really don't know what they want to do, they just know that they want to get their degree and kind of move on, that can help jumpstart you to try and look into figuring out what it is you might want to do down the line. It also helps, as I mentioned before, when you're in a program, the clearer you are when you get into a program, the more likely you are to succeed in it, complete it, and be able to use that degree to your advantage. There are people that I've known who've been 6 years into a graduate program and then finally figured out that that's not what they wanted to do and then dropped out. And that's a shame, because just because you don't finish the graduate program doesn't mean that you don't have to pay the loans, or at worst, even if you didn't have to pay a nickel, that's 6 years where you probably could have done something else and been a little bit farther on in your career or or another educational program, or just in life. So the more effort you put in now to try and figure out what you think you want to do, the more it's going to pay off down the line. One thing I'll say is, if you're going to graduate school because someone else wants you to, very often that's a path or a precursor to difficulties and unhappiness. So unless getting a degree is getting a degree for someone else, whether that's a spouse or a parent or something along those lines, unless that is a real core part of who you are, of you or of your culture, doing that because someone thinks it's a good idea could be very difficult. I was probably supposed to be an engineer. I'm a recovering math dork, and so my father to this day doesn't really understand what I do. I mean, he broadly does, but he doesn't really get it, and that's okay. But if I would have gone into what he thought I should be, I'd probably be an engineer or an actuary, and I'd probably be miserable doing that. So if you're going to put that much energy and effort, and you're going to be really kind of staking a good chunk, if not the majority of your adulthood into that career field, try to make sure it's something that you're interested in. Coming up in a couple of moments, I'm going to be giving you some guidelines about different career fields and degree options. But this can be a pretty complex issue. So one of the things I recommend that you do is working with a faculty member individually, particularly someone who is either in the field that you think you're interested in entering, or has experience, knows a good amount about that field. They can give you more kind of in-depth information and expertise about that particular arena. So, for example, I'm going to be much more adept at giving you information and pointers regarding the counseling field as a whole. My master's degree is in mental health counseling. My doctoral degree is in counseling psychology. I'm licensed as a psychologist in the state of Florida. And as I mentioned, I've worked in a couple of different career fields that involve teaching, testing, and assessment, and direct service counseling. And so those are the areas that I tend to know very well. I'd be less apt, and I have less expertise in, like, let's say, for example, social psychology. And so if social psychology is an area you want to get into, working with someone like Dr. Leone might be a much better fit for you. Okay, paging down a little bit, we're going to go to the alphabet soup portion. What does it all mean? There are a truckload of possible degrees out there. How do you know if you're choosing the right one? First, let's look at the basics. A bachelor's degree is usually a 4-year degree. It can be 5 in some cases if you're in certain areas like engineering or something along those lines. But a bachelor's degree is kind of the beginning foundational degree. It can often allow you to get into certain career fields, but some career fields are going to be shut out with a bachelor's degree, and that's why often people go on to graduate school. A master's degree is usually about 2 years, plus or minus, beyond a bachelor's. Okay? There are some programs, I think some education programs might be about a year to a year and a half, and then there's some master's programs that are going to be more about 3 years, kind of standard. But generally speaking, you're looking at about 2 years, maybe 2.5 years as being kind of standard master's degree, so 2 years beyond your bachelor's degree. A specialist degree is about 3 years, 2.5 to 3 years, so it's a little bit more than a master's degree beyond your bachelor's degree. As the term implies, there's a little bit more specialization with a specialist degree than a master's, but both of them generally are going to allow you to do very similar things. So you can get specialist degrees in mental health counseling, school counseling. Those are kind of the two big ones. Marital and family counseling, generally student personnel, those kinds of areas. And then you have a doctoral degree. A doctoral degree is usually going to be probably between 4 and 7 years beyond your bachelor's. A doctoral degree is usually the highest level, although sometimes you can get certificates, or there are postdoctoral work you can do. And so that gives you a sense of kind of the time frames. Well, hold on, I gotta get a sip of water. Next, let's take a look at degree, field, or discipline. This becomes complicated because there are a variety of potential fields and disciplines and sub-disciplines. One of the main distinctions that people often make is the basic principles versus application of knowledge distinction. The basic principles arena, well, the academic programs that are kind of in the basic principles area are often what we see as the liberal arts, as well as the sciences. And so things like psychology and sociology and poli-sci, bio, physics, history, those kinds of things. Those fit into the kind of basic principles arena. Whereas the application of knowledge arena are often things like education or nursing or business. And what that means is that they're a little bit more geared towards applying the basic principles, whereas the basic principles arena is part about application, it's part about kind of research and knowledge about the areas. And so, for example, history. You don't always apply history. You certainly can apply aspects of history to analysis of a particular situation, but history isn't always an area that's applied fully. Same thing with psychology. Psychology, believe it or not, is not always fully applied. Very often there's a lot of research done. Whereas areas like nursing, education, and business have research, but the research tends to be more in application. When we look at master's programs, the basic principles fields often will award one of two types of degrees, either an MA, which is a Master of Arts, or an MS, a Master of Science. MS degrees often may very well require a thesis, whereas Master of Arts does not. In the application of knowledge field, you can have a whole host of degrees. So you could have an MED for education, an MN for nursing, an MNS for nursing science. You could have an MHHP for health and human performance. You could have an MSW for social work. You could have an MBA for business administration. And so in the basic principles field, irrespective of the area you're in, you could get an MA in psychology or an MA in history or an MA in sociology or what have you. Whereas in the application of knowledge field, they often have degrees specific to their discipline, an MSW for social work, an MED for education, and so on. If we go to the doctoral level, the vast majority of degrees in the basic principles at the doctoral level are PhDs, a doctorate of philosophy. So for example, my degree is I have a PhD in counseling psychology, a doctorate of philosophy in counseling psychology. So the vast majority of degrees in the basic principles area at the doctoral level are going to be PhDs or doctors of philosophy. One of the major exceptions for our purposes is what we call a PsyD, P-S-Y-D, and that's a doctorate of psychology. PsyD programs generally do not require dissertations, so the emphasis on research is far reduced. For some terms that you may have heard before, most of your PhD programs are based on what we call the scientist-practitioner model, which means an approximately equal weighting of both science, in other words, producing research, and practice, the application of the research or the application of skills. The PsyD program is usually based on what we call the practitioner-scholar model, which means that they don't really focus on the production of research. It's more the consumption and understanding and how to use that in applying things. And so the weighting is much more heavily on the application, on the practitioner portion, than it is on the science. The science is there, but it's not from a production standpoint. It's more so that people understand it. The PsyD program is something that's conceptually it's relatively new. It's honestly it's about 35 or 40 years old at this point in time, but it's a distinct option for people who know that they want to do doctoral work in psychology, but also know that they don't really want to do a lot of research. So I think of one of my students when I was at UF in grad school, and I was doing my doctoral when I was doing my doctoral work, and I was working on my dissertation and doing research for it. One of my undergraduate research assistants was a young lady named Morgan, and Morgan ended up going on to graduate school for a master's degree up in Ohio, and I wrote a letter of rec for her at that point in time, and then she went on and she went on to doctoral work in Arizona, and she ended up getting a PsyD, and now she's Dr. Morgan Sprosty. So that's a good example of, she didn't really want to do a lot of research, and so the focus in PsyD programs is more on the understanding and consumption as opposed to the production of research. Nothing wrong with that. The focus is more on application. PsyD programs allow you to become a doctor the same way that a PhD program does. Allows you to become licensed in any of the states in the United States, so that's not an issue. There are some career areas that may be a bit more closed out, and so it's harder to teach with a PsyD because part of teaching often is production of research, running research studies and publishing, and if you didn't do it in your doctoral program, very often universities kind of have questions as to whether you're going to be able to do it at a later point in time, because did you receive the same training that allows you to do it. So it will shut out some career options, but if you know that you want to be a practicing psychologist and see clients and provide counseling and do testing and those kinds of things, a PsyD degree will be a very, very viable degree for you. I will say that one of the distinctions about PsyD programs is, as I mentioned before, PsyD programs do not really fund as well. There are more people in PsyD programs, and they have less money available since their professors don't do as much research because it's more on application. So you'll end up paying more out of pocket, generally speaking, for PsyD programs. The other thing is most PsyD programs are in private institutions. And private institutions, not state-run institutions like University of North Florida is a state-run, whereas something like JU is a private institution. Private institutions generally cost more. They're not subsidized by the state or the federal government, for that matter, at the same level. So it's another thing to consider. You may be taking on a larger debt load if you go the PsyD realm. That said, if you know it's what you want to do, and if you're very competitive, you may be eligible for some of the funding that they have. It can be a great degree for you. The other thing about a PsyD program is the vast majority of them are in clinical psychology arenas, program areas. So I think 2 or 3 of them are in counseling psych. There's Our Lady of the Lake in Texas. There's I think St. Thomas up in Minnesota, and I thought there was one more, but I don't remember where it is. And so if you want to go the clinical psychology route, PsyD works fine. If your discipline is more counseling psychology, it's going to be a much tougher road to hoe. So that's the basic principles area. The application of knowledge area, again, a lot of times they have doctoral degrees that may be very specific to their field. So a DSW is a doctorate in social work, or a DBA, a doctorate in business administration, an EDD, a doctorate in education, something along those lines. Sometimes programs will allow you to do either a PhD or a kind of field-specific one. So you could do an EDD or a PhD. Usually the difference is, in all those you generally have to do dissertations, but the difference is usually going to be how application-based it is versus how more technically research-based it is. PhDs are going to be more technically research-based, whereas something like an EDD or a DBA, Doctorate in Business Administration, is going to be much more application-oriented. So probably a little bit less on the statistical considerations or applications, and to be honest, PhD programs don't necessarily require that your research project be applied to anything out in the community. Okay, so why choose a master's over a doctorate or a doctoral program over a master's program? Some basic guidelines. Okay. First, grades. Well, I'll do this grades and GEREs kind of together. Guidelines for master's programs. Usually I would say a 3.2 GPA and 1,000 on the GRE combined. And the GRE is similar to the SAT in the sense that you're going to combine your verbal and your math or your quantitative and verbal scores. And so for a master's program, you're looking at a minimum of a 3.2 GPA and 1,000 GREs or guidelines. The higher you have, the better, but those are kind of, anything less than either one of those, you're going to need to be higher on one if you're going to be lower on the other. But both of those should put you in a relatively competitive area. GPA nowadays probably needs to be a little bit higher than 3.2, but 3.2 is kind of the classic guideline I usually tell people. At the doctoral level, you're looking at a GPA of really 3.5, and it's probably closer to 3.7 now. And combined GREs of 1,200 is kind of those minimum guidelines. Again, one's higher, the other one's lower. My GPA was, I think, about a 3.5, but my GREs were very strong, and so that helped kind of weigh things out. In guessing how you're going to do in the GREs, it's probably generally equatable to how you did on the SAT if you took the SAT. If you took the ACT or some other test, it's harder to equate. But the tests, the verbal and quantitative portions of the GRE are almost identical in content to the verbal and quantitative portions of the SAT. And so those are some guidelines. If your GREs aren't very strong, that may be a guide into a master's program, and then you can kind of show your ability there. Let's say that your GPA isn't particularly strong. I had a student of mine, Steve, at UNF, who didn't do particularly as well his first couple of years, and then finally kind of got his shit together and got serious. But his GPA was low. It was maybe like a 2.8. His GREs were pretty good, so he and I worked on getting him towards a master's program, and he went through the master's program and did very well. The other thing a master's program does is, I think I mentioned maybe on the first lecture, is it allows it to be a proving ground, and so you can actually improve your GPA. Well, I should rephrase that. You can establish a second GPA. So when you apply, you can report an undergraduate GPA and a graduate GPA. And as I mentioned before, in graduate school, the classes are much more specifically geared towards your area of interest, hopefully. And so sometimes people get very bored and not very motivated in classes that are outside their area. And that's why a lot of people will do much better in master's programs GPA-wise than they did in undergraduate, because they're much more interested in the topic area. So that's another reason to maybe think about a master's program. If one or both of the numbers are a little low, a master's program might fit better. Career options. Doctoral programs often allow you more specific career options. So as I mentioned before, the different areas that I can go into, I could see clients in private practice, which often is harder at the master's level, depending on the state. I could work in an institution or for kind of a business. I could teach. That usually is off limits to most master's degree individuals, at least at the university or college level. At the community college level, you may be able to teach more. I can do testing and assessment. Again, that's a little bit harder for master's level people to do. I can do expert witness testimony. It's harder for master's level people to do. I could do workshops and continuing education stuff. Now that's something that master's level people certainly can do and very often do. Other things that doctoral programs often provide greater status, greater monetary or earning potential. Now, that's not necessarily true when you first get out. When you first get out, it's actually fairly close between master's and doctoral level. But over time, while they both may start here or close to one another, master's may go up like this and doctoral may go up like this. And so in the beginning they may be very close, and later on they're going to be farther apart. And doctoral degrees often allow you greater independence. That said, they're harder to get into. They tend to be more strenuous. They have more hurdles to jump through. And so in a master's program, you may not have to do a thesis. In a doctoral program, particularly a PhD program, you'll have to do a thesis and a dissertation, and you'll have qualifying exams. Qualifying exams are a pain in the ass. It's essentially a series of exams or a project that demonstrates your knowledge in your field, and so it can be a very kind of long undertaking. Our qualifying exams were 8 hours of essays, and we didn't know what the essays were going to be beforehand. We were just told that there were going to be 4 areas: research, practice, ethics, and theory. Those were the 4 subject areas. And then we had a 5th essay on essentially our specialization. And we had 8 hours. We were given 2 essays in each area, chose one that you liked, and then just start writing. I've only studied for 2 things more than 1 day in my life, and qualifying quals were one of them. Quals I studied for I think 3 weeks. So there can be many more hurdles and difficulties in a doctoral program. It's going to take significantly longer to complete, and unless you're in a PsyD program, it's going to require research. Even in PsyD programs, they may have you do like a massive lit review as kind of a senior or a 4th year project, kind of a doctoral level project. So many things to consider. Questions, as I have kind of on the overhead, questions to consider: how sure am I of what I want to do? How committed am I to doing that, and possibly only that, for a significant portion of my career? Some areas allow you more breadth or latitude as far as the types of careers you can go into, like as I mentioned before. Others are much more specified. How much time or money or effort am I willing to put in? Those are important things to consider. What are the entrance requirements for the programs that I'm looking at, and how do I match up on those? That may, as I mentioned before, that may direct you more towards a master's than a doctorate. What are the graduation guidelines or requirements? And as I mentioned, often overlooked, what are the graduation rates of programs? So if you enter a doctoral program where only 50% of people graduate with their doctoral degree, while you might be a fabulous student, that means that essentially, plus or minus, there's about a 50-50 chance that you're going to complete. Those aren't the odds that you really want if you're going to be putting that kind of effort and time and money and that much stock in your career. So that's something to really consider. And then the last one, to research or not to research. That can help direct master's to doctorate, PsyD to PhD, and so on. Let's see. Some distinctions among related fields. As I mentioned before, psychology programs often function under the rubric of the scientist-practitioner model. That's particularly true at the doctoral level. Not quite as much on the master's level. Master's level, it's more in that practitioner-scholar or applied kind of focus. Classically, clinical psych was a little bit more geared towards that than counseling psych. But that distinction has kind of gone out in the wash now. My old program at UF, the counseling program, the professors there publish like fiends, and so very often that's a heavy-duty emphasis on those areas. In the what I'm going to call the non-applied areas. And that's just my terminology. Clinical and counseling are the more directly applied areas. In the non-applied areas, there's less on the practitioner portion because they're not quite as applied. It doesn't mean that in developmental you don't do applied work. You certainly do, but you don't get licensed in the same. You don't get licensed, and so you don't bill insurance. It doesn't require the same type of endeavor on an applied side. Those programs tend to be much more heavily research based, and so that's something to be clear that you're interested in doing. Doctoral programs require dissertations unless it's a PsyD. Master's programs may or may not require theses. Irrespective of how much emphasis is placed on research production, you'll get a reasonable amount in a master's and a hefty dose in a doctoral program of coursework in research. And so the focus will be on understanding research, as I mentioned before, consuming research, understanding it, being able to apply it. There's a pretty heavy emphasis on that in psych, whether it's master's or doctorate. You'll also get a reasonably heavy dose of psychological testing in psych programs, so where you'll get specific training on understanding, administering tests, being able to evaluate tests so that you can select one that may be most appropriate. And in all the subfields, clinical counseling, social, developmental, all the ones we talked about last week, there are specialized coursework for each particular sub-area. In the education realm, there are really two programs of interest for us, and that's going to be mental health counseling, which is also often termed counselor ed or counselor education, as well as school psychology. Mental health counseling is the discipline, but often their mental health counseling programs, most of the time, are found in counselor education departments. And so at UF, they have both. Well, at UF they have clinical psychology, they have counseling psychology, and they have mental health counseling in a counselor ed program. At UNF, they eliminated the Masters in Counseling Psychology program that was there up until about 2010. And so there is a mental health counseling program that's located in the College of Health, which is unusual. It used to be in the College of Education. Mental health counseling and slash counselor ed programs, they tend to focus a bit more on application and a little bit less on research than psychology programs do at the master's level. The divide becomes even greater at the doctoral level, although there's still a reasonable focus on research in a mental health program, mental health counseling program. Most master's degrees do not require a thesis. Doctoral programs require some form of dissertation, and they may not be quite as research oriented. Sometimes they may even allow people to do very extensive literature reviews. So check the program area of interest for that particular program at certain universities to make sure. There's also less emphasis on training for testing and assessment, and those that are tend to be more geared towards educational assessment. Now that's definitely true for school psychology. School psychology, as I mentioned in the first kind of lecture installment, school psychology is not really about counseling so much as it's about testing and assessment and helping teachers be able to provide educational services and instruction either to individual students or to classes more effectively. And so it's not really about counseling in the same way. There are school counselors, and school counseling is usually through mental health counseling or counselor ed program areas. If you want to be a therapist and you don't really want to bother with the research, a mental health counseling degree may be just the ticket. As I mentioned before, usually if you want to be a licensed mental health counselor, which is at a master's level, you can have a degree in clinical psychology, a master's degree in clinical psychology, a master's degree in counseling psychology, or a master's degree in mental health counseling through a counselor education department. So they allow you to sit for licensure in the vast majority of states and be able to provide services and do everything that someone with a master's in clinical or counseling psychology could do. School psychology is much more focusing on the testing and assessment portion, and that's going to be either educational, so things like learning disabilities and ADHD, or intellectual functioning. A little bit about personality, but it's mainly going to be on the intellectual and the educational focus. Some programs, well, all programs offer coursework in kind of basic psychological or counseling kind of skills, but that's usually going to be more for interviewing than providing ongoing therapy. If there is going to be focus on kind of therapy, it's probably going to be more in behavioral modification or in behavioral skills. So there's very little counseling compared to clinical or counseling or mental health counseling, but they still engage in some through interviewing and some basic intervention. They work on programs to either help individual students succeed or perform better in courses, or for more programmatic issues. It used to be that in order to be a school psychologist you had to have a doctoral degree, which could have been a PhD or an EDD, although at least in the state of Florida recently, people with specialist degrees, EDSs, in school psychology can act as school psychologists for the state of Florida. So that's something to consider. Third area is rehab counseling. Big surprise, it's more geared towards rehabilitation, and so that means often jobs in substance abuse counseling, independent living, and that could be for people who are developmentally disabled or have severe mental health issues. Rehab case management, vocational consultation, vocational evaluation or re-entry, and that might be working with people who are coming out of certain facilities. Child or geriatric services. So it's going to be more on that that rehab side. Testing assessment is, surprise, geared more towards rehab. Coursework will include counseling and diagnosis, like you would get in a similar to what you get in a mental health or a master's level psychology program area. The master's programs usually do not require theses. Doctoral programs will. Sometimes there are specializations. So some programs will have a specialization track in substance abuse counseling or something along those lines. So that's something to really look at. They don't tend to do a lot of testing and assessment, but again, it will be more towards rehab. And then the last little subfield up there I have is clinical social work. Clinical social work, similar to above, really not much, if any, training on testing. Coursework can certainly focus on the diagnosis and treatment of psychological issues. The thing I'll say about social work programs is there can be a pretty wide swath variety-wise as far as the training you get. Some MSW programs will train you well, MSW being Masters in Social Work. Some will train you very well in counseling skills and kind of interventions. So some will train you to be a counselor very well. Others really train you to be more case manager. And so one of the things I would do, particularly for a clinical social work and MSW program, if you're interested in that field, I would interview the programs and I would ask the directors of the programs, what are the most common jobs that your recent graduates, the last 5 to 10 years, what are the most common jobs that your graduates attain? What's the coursework? Does this allow me to sit for licensure? So that you can really look to make sure that if you want to do counseling, that it's going to provide the training that you're going to need. One of the good things that I'll say for MSW programs is after a certain amount of time and after you can become licensed. So you can become a licensed clinical social worker, LCSW, and LCSWs tend to have a lot of privileges and a lot of abilities that other master's level program areas don't. So you can set out a shingle and you can run your own business and you can directly bill insurance, which classically other master's level providers have had difficulty doing, although that's starting to open up. Additionally, from my understanding, I think all states in the nation in social work have the same licensure requirements. So if you were licensed in Florida and you wanted to move to New York or California or North Dakota or wherever it is, you would be eligible for licensure in that state. That's not true in other areas. In psychology and in counselor ed or mental health counseling, the licensure requirements vary from state to state. And so sometimes, for example, at the doctoral level, in most states, you need 1 year postdoctoral counseling work in order to get licensed. In Alabama, you need 0, and in a few states like Tennessee, you need 2. So that could be a bit of a damper. Whereas for social work, from my understanding, the requirements for licensure in each state are standardized across all states. So if you meet the requirements in one state, you'll meet the requirements in another, and that's very helpful. Last piece is the difference between licensure and certification. You thought you were done after you graduated, and that's not necessarily true. So licensure is something that is governed generally by a state, and it acts as a gatekeeper, kind of like a quality assurance piece. So, for example, I'm a licensed psychologist in the state of Florida, and I have been since 2007 or something like that. Licensure requirements in psychology, in mental health counseling, and I believe in rehab counseling vary from state to state, and that's true at the master's and the doctoral levels. So, for example, the term psychologist. In order to be to call yourself a psychologist, be able to kind of put that out as your title and to promote yourself as a psychologist, in most states you have to have a doctoral degree, PhD or PsyD. In some cases an EDD if you got grandfathered in. However, in some states you don't. So when I worked in North Carolina, they had master's level psychologists, which we don't have in the state of Florida. We have psychologists at the doctoral level and mental health counselors at the master's level. So, so even the terminology can change from state to state, but licensure is something that is connoted by a state or given by a state. Licensure is usually critical for being able to bill insurance. So if you're going to be providing services and the person has Blue Cross Blue Shield or whatever kind of insurance they have, if you aren't licensed in that state or working under a licensed person, the insurance company won't reimburse you. And so that can be a big deal. Let's see what else. Social work, as I mentioned before, has kind of standardized guidelines for all 50 states, so that's helpful. But the other areas, whether it's master's or doctoral, don't. So it's something to really consider. Certificates or certification is usually is not given by a state. It's usually provided by an institution of some form. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean an institution like a university, though sometimes it can be. But I'll give you an example. My partner is a behavior analyst, and behavior analysts don't get licensed because states don't recognize it as a field for licensure, but she's certified, so she has a certification, and there's what is the ABA, the American Behavioral Association, something along those lines, that gives certification. And so you have to go through, you have to take a test, and you have to be able to show that you have the right degree and so on. But certificates allow you some additional privileges, but they're usually more limited than licensure. Now, you don't really have a choice. Certification is usually certification or licensure. Your fields won't usually have both. That's different than getting a certificate if you take some specialized courses from the university. Sometimes that will allow you to get certification, but those are different entities. So certification is something that's usually provided by an entity like either a university, or most of the time it's going to be an organization like the American Behavioral Association, or hypothetically could be like American Historians or something like that. Whereas licensure is something that's provided by a state. And licensure is, both of them are meant to kind of act as gatekeepers so that you can be relatively sure that when someone says that they are a licensed psychologist, that means that they have gone through certain levels of training, experience. They've had to take a test in order to show their knowledge. They've been supervised in their interventions, and then they're providing counseling. They have to take continuing education credits very often to say that, show they're keeping up with updated research and so on. Let's see, whatever. So those are the main pieces about degree options. We'll talk more about these as we go through the semester, but that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it. The next topic area that we'll be covering will be degrees that you can attain with an jobs that you can attain with an undergraduate degree, and that should be coming up in the next couple of days. So remember, again, your career assessment assignments are due on the 15th. That's this Friday, by the tail end of the day. And you can submit them through Blackboard. There's a portal where you can attach the reviews, and that'll be fine. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. And until later, I'm signing off.